the tissue of of previous years. But we don't ever think about handling woody plants the same way, or most of the time, I don't think we do. You know, the way we handle herbaceous perennials. Like, you wouldn't think about just cutting this big tree down and having it regrow the next year. But in fact, it does happen, obviously. Like, you know, you have this white birch, and then for whatever reason, if it's cut down, it can resprout again. And that's the amazing thing about many woody plants, is they do have this ability to come back from the roots, much like an herbaceous perennial. It makes a lot of sense, especially if you're a shrub like this Physocarpus. This is growing in a wild along Lake Superior, where the waves and the wind are constantly beating down in those stems. And so it's able to put up new stems from the base during the growing season. Of course, in the landscape where conditions are better, it doesn't necessarily die back that way, and it keeps getting larger and larger and larger. But adding these woody plants into mixed plantings really adds a lot of diversity to the plantings. And I think most of us, we love trees and shrubs and also perennials and bulbs and things like that. But the challenge is how to share the space, so to speak, because when things are newly planted, where you have woody plants in with herbaceous things, everything has its own space, and they can share, and the perennials get the light that they need, and the trees and shrubs are growing. But as you know, as well as I do, over time, the woody plants, because they're continually adding girth and adding those above ground parts, end up taking over, and your area where you can plant your herbaceous stuff or your annuals, like these poppies, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think people have this reticence and fear about cutting these woody plants back. You know, not everybody. Some people love it. You know, you get this gal with the gas-powered hedge clippers, and she's ready to go. But there's some advantages to managing certain woody species, almost like you manage herbaceous species, and that's the subject of the talk tonight. There's, you know, some of the advantages, like it's easier to clean up. I mean, this is one of our beds when I was up in Maine, where we cut back the hydrangeas and the spireas and many of the other plants in this rose garden, and then we can get in and do all the sort of the mulching and bulb planting and things like that too. As you probably have experienced, sometimes with woody plants, you get pernicious weeds like thistle that get established underneath them, where you can't really get into them and see them, and then they'll spread out into the beds, and it makes that control harder too. So you have this sort of the problem of them taking over and shading out your other plants. The management a little more difficult too. So I guess the question that I have for you in this talk is, what are we afraid of? Like, what are we afraid of when it comes to cutting back and managing woody plants in a mixed garden kind of situation? Certainly, if you look at the tools of horticulture, this is in Milburn, this great antique tool collection. Like, I love these are all tools for primarily cutting back woody plants. I mean, you could say the hedge clippers, you could cut back herbaceous stuff too, but I mean, look at these old-fashioned hedge pruners. I mean, those are dangerous pieces of equipment. But these are all managed to are designed to manage woody plants for the most part, and we're familiar with things like cutting back roses. That's a woody plant that we manage in this way, and obviously cutting back roses can reinvigorate the plant and keep it in check and allow you to prune out dead wood and all those sorts of things you do when you're handling rose plants. So there's different levels of it too. I mean, you can have a light touch, like in this case. This fellow is just very delicately trimming, hedging his plant, where he's just snipping off the new growth and doing it several times just to keep that plant in a certain shape. Hedging is a little different, though, I'm going to talk about. This is pollarding, which is a kind of a European technique, as far as I understand, where you basically cut back most of the new growth of the tree every year to both keep it from getting too large and shading out what's underneath, but also to create kind of an aesthetic effect. So they're not cutting into the older wood, but they're just cutting back most of the new growth of that tree. And at the Morris Arboretum, we do that too, especially in places like the rose garden, where not only are we cutting back the roses, but there's other woody species in there. Like you can see the cotinus, the smoke bush in the background there that there's a magnolia. This is kind of an older picture. And managing these things in a way that's keeps everything in scale, so that the herbaceous plants and the roses all are sort of in check with each other. When you're cutting back woody plants, there's several things that you need to keep in the back of your mind, and one is the severity of how you're cutting the back, how the new growth is going to be responding from those cuts, the time of year to do it, and that sort of thing. So it's important to understand the difference between adventitious and dormant buds, first of all. So this is where that new growth comes back when you've actually cut that woody stem down. This is a picture of a redwood sprouting in the redwood forest through adventitious buds. So adventitious buds are formed from the bark tissue or the inner bark of a tree. So in that birch that I showed you before, when that was cut down, the root system responded by releasing hormones that cause that meristematic tissue, that growth tissue in the bark, to form new growing points. And you can see here, this is a poplar, and these are all little growing ports coming out of the bark. And if you're a woodworker and you know about burls and burl wood and that sort of thing, a lot of this is coming from these kind of growths, because you've got all these little growing points. It causes really interesting patterning in the woods. In the wood, but it's a little risky if this tree is not healthy, or something else happens. You cut it back like this, it may not actually resprout from this kind of tissue. This is sort of this is a major surgery that most of us probably are not going to do just to prune a plant. The safer way to do it is to basically prune to encourage dormant buds. This is an apple tree, and if you pruned apples, you're cutting back, in this case, most of the previous year's growth. So this was the previous year's growth here, and this is a bud coming back from the previous year's growth. So most of that has been taken away. So when you cut the top off, you've released these side buds. And this is a lot safer because these buds have already been formed. They're also connected all the way down to the center of this twig, whereas adventitious buds are just connected to that living skin around the edge of the trunk. So I think if you're a little tenuous, or if you can do it, it's better to try to prune lightly and more often than heavily and less often. So here's two examples of what I'm talking about. On the left is a hydrangea paniculata. This was growing along the foundation of my house. The previous owners had planted it, had gotten really big. It was shading out the windows. So I just came by with a saw and cut it almost down to the ground. So you can see here that this bud kind of sprouted out from the wound tissue. And then these others did too. So this is what I would consider adventitious sprouting, where they just came out of the bark. Now, on the other side is another hydrangea where every year, and this is how I manage a lot of the ones that I grow, I cut it back I cut most of the last year's growth back down during the dormant season, but I don't cut it all down. So at each one of these nodes, there's dormant buds, and these can resprout and grow. So, risky, but sometimes necessary. But a lot easier. And I actually, structurally, this I think gives better look, and it's easier for the tree or the shrub to heal and to recover from a surgery like that. You can do that. You can see here, this is back at Milburn too, where they're managing managing these trees by cutting them back several times during the growing season. So here they're cutting back the new growth of the year during the growing season. This is really what I would call more hedging. So with hedging, what you're doing really is partway through the growing season, you're just pinching things back, and then they can resprout. And this is really the least invasive technique, and something we're probably all familiar with. The advantage of light regular pruning is you really can develop, not only keep the plant in check, but develop really interesting aesthetic shapes. You can guide the growth of the plant, much like that with these trellised apples, to get interesting architectural shapes, as well as keeping it from taking over this whole bed. So if you're going to do not hedging, but you're going to cut things back, whether lightly or heavily, what are the good characteristics of a good cutback shrub, or in some cases tree, but usually shrubs? So flowering on new growth, which I'll talk about, deciduous species. In general, evergreen species respond less favorably to regular cutting back, especially coniferous species. But fast-growing deciduous flowering on new growth, and I guess it stands to reason, at least root hardy. But that's an important point that I'll talk about too. Case in point is Ceanothus. The Ceanothus, this is a hybrid of New Jersey tea with a Guatemalan species. So it's not terribly stem hardy, but it is root hardy, and so it naturally tends to die back and come back from the roots in a hard winter. You can handle it that way. Most of the time down here in the mid-Atlantic, Vitex will be stem hardy, but occasionally in a hard winter, it'll die back down, and we cut it back down. So these are plants that naturally do this, responding. And the reason that Vitex will work that way, or you think of a butterfly bush, for example, too, or even roses, is that they flower on the new growth of the year. So they tend to, they put out their new growth in the spring, and then that grows, and then they'll form flower buds off of those tissues, and then they'll flower. Now, this magnolia, for example, flowers on the old growth. We see those magnolia buds this time of year overwintering, like rhododendrons, and things like pussy willows, crab apples. They flower on old wood. So if your goal is to have flowers in your garden, you don't want to cut these back every year. You'll never see a flower. Whereas plants like spireas, vitex, ceanothus, they flower on that new wood. So you can cut them back every year, and they will flower again. How do you tell? It takes, sometimes if it's not a plant that you've ever grown before, it takes a little experience. You can try and see what happens if you cut it back every year. But generally, plants that flower on the growth of the year flower later in the season. So they're not flowering in early spring. They're flowering more in late spring, summer, as that growth matures. Some species or some varieties are bred that are normally plants that flower on old wood, like hydrangeas. This is one of the remontant hydrangeas, the reflowering hydrangeas, endless summer, and this actually is a selection that will not only bloom on the old wood, which is what you're seeing down along the bottom here, but also you can see new buds coming out on the new growth of the season too. So it's flowering on both. So in this case, with this particular variety, you could cut this back hard every year and still have it flower a little bit later. But if you grow some of the hydrangea macrophyllus that are not reblooming, that don't bloom on new wood, you cut them back hard every year, or you are growing them in a place where they're marginally hardy, and they die back to the ground, die back down almost to the ground, they won't really flower, and you'll end up with just a bunch of leaves. I think we probably all had that experience with hydrangeas in hard winters. So does this mean you have to cut back everything every year? No, you have to just sort of learn. And I think look at how plants grow and decide, if they need this kind of management, if they don't, how often to do it. The Calycanthus is a species that I'll talk a little bit more later, but this is a plant that blooms on the previous year's wood. So you can see here the leaves are coming out and these flowers are growing. But if you've grown Calycanthus, especially some of the hybrids, they get to be pretty big plants and you need to manage them. So maybe cut them back every third year or so. Fothergilla, a plant that normally stays pretty, pretty self-contained, but eventually some of the stems make it kind of old, or you may need to trim it back a little bit. You can think about managing it that way every 5 to 7 years. You can see in this picture, this is a Fothergilla Mount Airy, all the new stems that are coming out below here. So if you cut these older stems back, you're encouraging those new stems to flower. And that's an important point, because there's this concept of juvenility that stems, and this is the case often with shrubs, stems that have matured and that are reproductive. Basically, as I feel myself, as I'm getting older, I'm losing vigor, right? I'm not flowering as much. I'm not producing as much fruit. I'm not growing as much. And stems are that way, where if you cut a plant back, you can induce that sort of juvenility and vigor back into the shrub. It's that concept with lilacs, and I'll circle back to that in just a few minutes. But that surge of growth and all that new tissue can also be good for wildlife too. This is a Cecropia moth feeding on or emerging from a cocoon on a myrick or a bayberry, and the mother moth was attracted to this plant because this was cut back the year before, so it had a lot of new growth coming out of it. And with all that new growth, a lot of nutrients in the leaves, soft succulent leaves, a good source of food for its larvae. So by cutting these plants back, you're also maybe encouraging the moths and butterflies and other insects that feed on these plants in a sustainable way. A word of warning: if you have grafted plants, you have to be careful to use these kind of techniques. A grafted plant where a desirable woody plant has been grafted onto a rootstock of more of a common plant because it's hard to propagate otherwise. It stands to reason, it's pretty obvious, but if you cut this down below the graft here, what's going to resprout is going to be the understock or the less desirable plant, and not the plant that you want to propagate. And so you can see here that with this witch hazel, that witch hazels are typically propagated by cuttings, and so if you cut this once it's established, you cut it down here, you're going to get the understock resprouting. You can see this is what's happening here, where that understock is resprouting, and then the grafted plant here is losing out. So if you do have to cut back grafted plants, just really pay attention to where that that graft lesion is, where the two were joined together, and try to keep your pruning well above that point. I would say at least 6 inches or to a foot above that graft union, or else you're going to just get the undesirable plants coming back. So technique. There's a lot of different ways you can do this, but there's a lot of ways you can do it badly. I think the poor crepe myrtles are the poster child for bad pruning. People tend to just be merciless with these shrubs because they're so adaptable. But here, really what this is what I would call a pretty hard pruning, where they're taking back several years of growth all the way back to the central stem. And then you're relying on that adventitious growth, adventitious buds forming to regrow that canopy. You've got large wounds there that have to heal over. A better way to do this is to do that light pruning, like I was showing you with the hydrangea, where you're just taking back a little, you're taking back most of the new growth every year, but not completely. So again, like here, cutting this back to one or two nodes where the buds are going to be in these nodes, one or two nodes from the bottom. And so, and often when we're doing this commercially or we're in a hurry, you can come in kind of roughly and just do a quick pass with a gas powered trimmer, or you can just with head shears or something like that, and then go back in and just carefully clean up the cuts. Where here we're going in and taking out maybe some of the dead stems, and then pruning the rest of these back so that there isn't a big gap between the next node where the buds are going to be and the dead stem. But it's easy sometimes to just clean, because cleaning out the work surface and then coming back and then cleaning it up later. But this is again the Physocarpus. This is Diablo, the red leaf, one of the early red leaf ones. You can see the way this responds. So this is probably 6 or 7 feet of growth that has come back from that stem later in the year. Plants really do, especially shrubs, multi-stem shrubs respond really well to this. Here's a red leaf sumac, the wing sumac, and here it's getting a little bit big for the space. This is what it looks like. I just went in there during the dormant season and cut this back almost all the way. Now it's hard with this one to really see where the dormant buds are. So you're just kind of guessing as best you can, but cutting this back. And why do this in the wintertime? Because this is when the shrub or the tree has drawn a lot of its resources down into its root system. And so by removing the tops, you're removing them at the least impactful time of the year. So in the spring, as there's that surge of sugars back up into the top of the tree, it'll feed those buds and start growing again. If you did this in the summertime, you could really weaken the shrub. You can also encourage really late season growth, which can be damaged by the cold when it comes in. So I like to do this kind of pruning really in late winter. So I would say, starting late February into most of the months of March is in this area is really about the best time to do it. But this is how it came back. But by the end of one growing season, you can see that's recovered, and that's about 3 feet high. So really easy to do. So, sumac is almost a weed, but even the kind of the cultivars, this is the tiger eyes sumac. And here in this mixed planting, it had gotten to the point where we're starting to shade out the Amsonia here. And so we cut this back, and then you can see the next year it sprouted out, and it's much more kind of in keeping with that overall design. And we were able to use those stems as supports for vines like morning glories in the garden too. So nothing went to waste. So just going to show you some plants that are really easy to try, and maybe plants that you've worked with before, but hydrangeas, especially the hydrangeas that bloom on the new wood, really great for this, like the hydrangea arborescens. If you haven't seen it, Mount Cuba just put out a great just paper on their review of hydrangea arborescens cultivars, and it's you can find it on their website. I just read it. It's really interesting. There's a lot of cultivars that I hadn't seen before. But we cut these back in the wintertime, and you can see here they're just starting to come up as we've an underplanting of alliums in there to sort of hide the fact that the shrub structure is gone. And then later on in the cereus and the hydrangeas have grown up as the alliums have died back. And so these are, this is Incredible and Invincible Spirit in pink here. And same sort of thing in mixed plantings. I mean, I like the dynamism of the growing season. And so this is a mixed planting here where these are hydrangea paniculatas, and there's arborescens in here early in the spring after they've been cut back. So what you're really looking at is the perennials as well as the flowering trees, and not distracted by kind of the dead stems of the shrubs. Later on in the summer, as the later perennials are coming in flower, you start to see the hydrangeas blooming. And then in the fall, you get that kind of full effect of the seed heads before they're cut back in the winter. Now, if you want to be really crazy and do something fun, I was up in Sleepy Hollow 2 Halloweens ago, and they were sort of painting these for for Halloween. So you can have, fun like this because you're going to cut them back anyway. So you can decorate them for the holidays before you cut them back. Some hydrangeas work, some don't. This is hydrangea involucrata that blooms mostly on the new woods, so that will do well to be cut back every year. Whereas the oak leaf hydrangea, if you cut that back every year, you'll probably never see any flowers because it flowers on the old wood. Now, if you are just planting a new shrub in the landscape, don't start cutting it back right away. Give it a little time to establish. I would give it at least a year to get its root system established and build up its energy reserves before you cut it back. So this is a elderberry that was in the ground for 1 year, and it's getting kind of lanky, and that's okay to cut back. Elderberry is a great and a really easy shrub to treat this way. And there's many different cultivars out there with different leaf colors and textures, but it responds almost like an herbaceous perennial. It grows so quickly and it flowers on the new growth and fruits. So really easy to handle that way. So really any of the elderberries that you can grow will respond well to this kind of annual winter pruning. With the exception of this, the red elder, which flowers on the new growth. But for the most part, they're really great for cutting back every year. Any of the spireas, whether it's the native spireas or the Japanese species, you can almost like run a lawnmower over them. I mean, they're that easy to have come back, and I find that they flower and have much better presentation if I give them a hard pruning every year. This is that same garden where here's the tiger eye sumac coming up. These are all Spirea tomentosa that we cut back to kind of keep them in size with the annuals, and here they are later in the year, just and looking really in scale and almost like an herbaceous perennial in this case. So those are the keys. Flowering on new wood, easy, vigorous growth. There's other advantages too, like Durvilla. I use this a lot in Maine. It was very much a bulletproof shrub, grows just about anywhere, grows in rocks and that sort of thing. But we were using this also places that we would pile snow. I got to say the snowfall so far since I lived down here in Pennsylvania, not so bad, but I guess, that means we're due for a really big one. But if you have places like the edge of the parking lot and you're dumping snow on there, not great for a lot of shrubs because they're getting crushed by the snow and they look horrible. But in this case with the Durvilla, we would just pile the snow there in the spring come and then just cut it all back, and it would resprout and look great for the rest of the year and bloom like crazy and make a nice sort of landscape. So these cutback shrubs for places where you've got to do a lot of maintenance activities like that, I think is also something to be a real advantage. So just some other plants. This is buttonbush cephalanthus, which is interesting that when I see this in the wild, it's always growing in these flooded kind of conditions. But as a landscape shrub, it grows perfectly fine, just in a typical garden situation. And it's in a group that's mostly tropical. It has these flowers that are really evolved for butterfly pollination. So it's really one of the best native butterfly bushes that I can think of. It doesn't flower quite as long as the as Buddleia, as the Asian butterfly bush, but if you cut it back, it blooms for a lot longer. And so here we've managed it, instead of letting it grow up and cut it back down almost to the ground every year. And because these vigorous stems are coming up at different times, they flower over different times. So instead of a 2 or 3 week flowering period, we're getting a 6 or even 8 week flowering period out of this shrub. Since I've been at the Morris, I've also enjoyed this Adina rubella, which is the Chinese buttonbush. This is one I've got one out in front of the farmhouse where I live that Paul Meyer planted, and it's really a beautiful plant. What I've noticed about this species is the butterflies don't seem to like it as much, but when I go out at night, it's covered with night flying moths. So it must be a night, mostly a night fragrant kind of plant that's pollinated during the nighttime. So Clethra, another easy one to try, a great species for a myriad of pollinating insects. And just like the ceanothus, if you cut it back, it will flower a lot more and flower over a longer period of time. It's it's pretty easy to do. This is one that we cut back. This is just 1 year's of growth. So this was cut back during the dormant season, and it grew up about 3 feet and flowered really, really well. So you don't have to worry about that. This is a dwarf cultivar called 16 Candles that's planted right up against the building. And we cut this back every year, and it flowers profusely, almost really, I think, better. And it has to do with that juvenility, that juvenile growth with all that energy coming up from the root system encourages more longer blooming, but also larger flower panicles and just a better floral effect overall. That's why people cut back roses, right? The same kind of idea. And if you, if you're in an area where you're dealing with marginal hardiness, Clethra isn't really a plant that's generally marginal around here. But in the case of Clethra tomentosa, which is a Florida species, it can be a little bit marginal. It doesn't really matter because it'll just come back up from the roots anyway. There are other Clethra species too that I don't think people think of the same way, but this is the cinnamon Clethra, which is a Appalachian species and has a beautiful peeling bark on it and a larger stature than summer sweet, but will deal well with cutting back too. These stems, it's hard to tell from the picture, but these are about 1 inch in diameter, and these are 1 year sprouts. So we cut this back, and these sprouts came out and grew about 6 feet tall, 7 feet tall, with 1 inch diameter stems after one growing season. It was pretty amazing. And I've handled some of the Asian Clethra the same way, although with Clethra barba nervis, I find that that cutting it back so hard all the way almost down to the ground, it really doesn't develop these beautiful stems as much. So this is one that you might want to manage a little bit more, like I was showing you with the hydrangeas. One of the other things I love about woody plants is that for foliage effect, that it's hard to find herbaceous perennials often that have those big tropical looking leaves, especially for sunnier conditions. But there are trees that do. Catalpa is one. And this is a plant that's really easy to cut back. It grows really, really fast from sprouts. You can see how this is basically pollarded down, where they're cutting it down almost all the way back, but not down to the main trunks, just snipping back most of the growth. Cotinus, you may have tried this too. Smokebush is one of the classic cutbacks, and it grows incredibly fast. So you take this down almost to the ground, and you can get 12, even 15 feet of growth in one season. It's really remarkable to see. And the one thing you notice here is, what are we missing here? No flowers. So in the case of Cotinus, it doesn't necessarily flower that well from the cutbacks, but often if you're growing this for foliage, it doesn't really matter. There are dwarf ones too. If you really like the flowers, something like Young Lady here is naturally more compact, so you don't have to necessarily worry about it. Crepe myrtles are a plant that are becoming a lot hardier around here, from what I understand. It used to be that crepe myrtles were pretty iffy plants, and some of the really fancy ones, like these Black Diamond, the red-leaved ones, are still a little marginal. But here in the rose garden at the Morris, we treat that as a cutback shrub. So even though it may winter kill a little bit, it comes back and flowers in the new growth. I've talked a little bit about 9-bark, and really another easy one to grow. And like the Cotinus, it doesn't flower well when you cut it back, but another advantage of cutting back, if you're growing plants with colored foliage, is typically colored foliage is more intense on the newer growth as the leaves tend to age. they lose some of that color. And so by cutting that back every year, we're losing the flowers, but we're really enhancing the color effect of the foliage. And this is the case with things like Dart's Gold, the orange ones. There are compact ones too, if you want sort of to keep it in perennial scale, but not lose the flowers. This is one called Little Devil, which just get very big. And there are others that bloom on new wood too. So, but in general, like I like that billowy effect of the larger plants with that new growth coming out in the fall color. In the summer color, it's a great mixer in with larger perennials. I mentioned the sweet shrub Calycanthus before. As I said, this is not a plant I would cut back every year, but this is the kind of growth that it can put out in 1 year. So this was cut back the season before, so you can see in the wintertime how much it grew, probably 3 or 4 feet from the root systems there. And then we leave it alone for a few years so it's able to flower and grow. I've been really impressed with this one at the Arboretum. We put this in a few years ago, Burgundy Spice. And this is really, when you look for red-leaved foliage plants that hold their color during the summer heat, this is really one of the best ones that we have now at the Arboretum. I think I've really liked this. The flowers of Calycanthus are not, particularly noticeable. They can be okay, but really that foliage effect is on that Burgundy Spice is the main thing. The hybrids between the Chinese species and the native Calycanthus are really pretty spectacular, though. It's amazing how a lot of times when you cross two distant related species together, you don't really get much. But in this case, it's really an improvement, just amazing improvement over either species as far as flower. However, the habit is a little bit, it's worse. They get very sort of rank growing, and you have to keep them trimmed back so they don't get too crazy. Now, fruits. Flowers lead to fruits, right? And you sort of, the next thing is like you're not just growing shrubs, especially for flowers and foliage. You're growing them for fruit effect too. But what I was saying about flowers holds true for fruits. That when you cut back these shrubs, especially, you're encouraging that vigorous growth. You're also you're encouraging more flowers, which can lead to a lot more fruits too. So case in point is the native winterberry. If you leave this alone, eventually the winterberries get kind of lax and they don't flower a lot. And that has to do with the fact that they're not putting out a lot of new growth. And so not a lot of new growth every year, short growths, not a lot of flowers, not a lot of fruits. And if you cut this back every few years, you'll get those vigorous stems with lots of berries. So when you buy winterberry at a florist or something like that, and you've got those long stems with lots of fruits on there, it's because they're coppicing these back, cutting them back every few years to encourage that growth. So it works with any of the female cultivars that are out there. But again, you don't want to do it every year. The hollies bloom on the new wood, but they don't respond well to cutting back every year. You're talking maybe once every 5 to 7 years or so. This is a large one that was out in the front of the farmhouse where I live here on the Arboretum. It had gotten so big that it had kind of sprawled out and taken over this whole area. And so I went in during the wintertime with the chainsaw and cut all these stems back to within 6 inches or so. And why 6 inches? Well, I wasn't sure here whether I was going to get adventitious buds or going to get dormant buds. So this was just sort of a hedge on the bets. And in the springtime, you can see all these sprouts coming up. And by the end of the growing season, this is what was left here. And so now they're up to about 3 feet or so, and I think next spring they'll start flowering. So it took a couple of years for them to recover, but then I'll have to eventually go in here in a few years and thin these out a little bit to keep them a little bit more manageable, but easily came back. And there are dwarf cultivars too. So this is red Sprite, which is nice because you don't have to necessarily manage it as severely as that. Calicarpa, easy to manage as a cutback shrub, whether it's the native species or the some of the Chinese species. They grow really, really fast. This is 1 year's growth from cutting back, about 5.5 feet tall or so. And again, just like I was saying with the ilex, all the flower buds come in the axils of the growth. So you're getting huge sprays of fruits and an amazing fruit effect if you cut these back hard. Going from Pennsylvania up to Maine, this is the Maine blueberry fields here, and blueberries are interesting. That up in Maine, what they'll do is they'll manage these fields. They'll get a great harvest, and then the next year they burn or cut the whole thing back, and then the following year they get some growth, and the third year they get great fruiting again. So I don't know that this is a technique that you're going to want to use in your suburban garden, but it shows you the toughness of these plants, that they can bring these big flamethrowers out to these fields and basically burn these blueberries down to the ground, so that they and then they'll resprout from the roots. But the reason they're doing this is partly that is weed control, and partly to encourage all that vigorous juvenile growth that's going to lead to lots of fruiting. So I knew somebody that owned in Philadelphia that owned blueberry fields in Maine, and he said every third year he got a big paycheck because that's how they were managing those things. So this is aronia. It's also a plant that's becoming the aronia juice is becoming an orchard crop. So they're handled the same way too, where you can coppice these back every few years. So this is these were cut back 2 years ago. These were 3 years ago. They'll cut these back on a 3 or 4 a year rotation to just make sure that berry production is really peak, and they don't want to cut back the whole thing at the same time. But aronias are they're amazing shrubs. They grow in very, very tough conditions. This is growing just in the cracks of rocks that aronia is growing, so very easy to cut back. But there are also dwarf cultivars too. This is a couple of the compact versions that don't need such severe pruning. Prunus marittima is another one that I love, the beach plum, because it's not only it's beautiful in flower and the pollinators love it. It's got great fall color, but you can pick all those plums and make jam out of them if you want to. But again, these were cut back 2 years previously. You can see all those vigorous stems and all the flowers that are along here. So on every other kind of a pruning. So I mean, this is one of those things where it's a fine line between what I would call rejuvenative pruning and just maintenance pruning. Rejuvenative pruning is really where you've got a plant that's older and you're trying to it's starting to fail. It's not doing well. It's not flowering well, and you want to bring it back. So I would say true rejuvenative pruning is more in that sort of 10 to 20 or 30 year time horizon, where you're relying more on those adventitious buds to get that plant back. Lilacs are a plant that a lot of people think of when they think of rejuvenative pruning, because if you've ever grown lilacs, not necessarily becoming the best plant for the mid-Atlantic, but they tend to peter out after a while, and that's because the stems. This is a plant that's used to suckering and putting up new growth, and so those stems run out of energy after a while. And just by going back and cutting the back hard, encouraging that juvenile growth, you can bring them back and they can flower quite well. So what I consider kind of our native lilac, the Cheonanthus, same thing. Cheonanthus can get kind of big and sprawling and start to lose vigor. But if you cut that back, you can keep it in check, but also encourage flowering and fruiting. And even some of the evergreen species too, like mountain laurel. This is a wild grove of mountain laurel, And part of this is deer browse, but it's also just that it's gotten shady as these trees have grown up, and these trees are losing vigor. I lived in Connecticut for a while where we had a lot of wild mountain laurel, and in places where they were just really losing vigor, I went in and just cut them down almost to the ground during the wintertime. And they resprout very, very vigorously because they're sort of a fire disturbance adapted shrub. And this is the growth that came out just in one season after cutting that shrub back. So evergreen plants in the Ericaceae and the heath family, like rhododendrons, mountain laurel, you can treat them as cutback shrubs, but you have to look at it more on that like rejuvenation, so in the sort of 10, 15-year horizon. So this is the native Great Bay or rhododendron maximum. And here, these were big plants, cutting them back. And all this growth here that you see is just 2 years old. So it's amazing how fast they come back from being cut back. So I see there's some questions in the chat, so I'm going to leave it there and go on to the questions. But I say, don't let this happen to you. Feel empowered, hopefully, to go out and try some of these things. And if you're not local here, I hope you'll come visit us in the spring here at the Morris Arboretum. So I will stop sharing here and look at some of these chat questions. Probably have to go back to the beginning.
Yeah, Bill, one of the early questions was if one of your photos was from the Chelsea Flower Show. That was just like slide 3 or 4 in.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
I could go back and see. Let me just see, because you won't see this, I don't think. The one of the kind of the mixed boarding. No, that wasn't at Chelsea, but it does look kind of like a Chelsea Flower Show picture.
Yeah. And then the next question was from Candy, and she asked if she said her Alyssium is growing like crazy, but is not deciduous. So do any of these rules apply? Help, please.
Yeah, I think with the evergreens, it's safer to treat them more like hedging, where you're cutting the new growth partly of the way back, but not really doing hard pruning. I haven't tried a hard pruning on that, so I'm not sure what would happen. But anybody else have any experience with that one? Okay.
Brian Broderick asked, in terms of a rule for when to cut for flowering shrubs, he's asking if there's any argument to the general rule that the best time to prune is after the plant flowers, as long as it's not heading into winter.
I try to avoid that if I can, because again, when you look at there's sort of a carbohydrate cycle with perennial plants, whether they're herbaceous or woody, where they're after they flower, they're really at their weakest point because they put so much energy into reproduction. And so by cutting them back more, then you're further weakening them. Whereas in the dormant season, they've accumulated all those carbohydrate reserves during the growing season and pulled them back down into the roots. And so they're much stronger. So if you're going to prune after flowering, say an azalea or something like that, you can prune lightly, more like hedging, where you're taking off at the most maybe half of the current year's growth. But I wouldn't do a hard pruning unless it's something that you really don't care about, or is just incredibly vigorous that you're not worried about it.
Okay, and then Sally Burry said that she was concerned about suckering and was concerned about hard pruning because of suckering. Is it an issue? She's been cautious because of that. I think it will happen depending on the plant.
And I think if you have things that are prone to suckering, certainly if you're trying to encourage one stem and you have a lot of suckering coming out there, by cutting that back, you're going to encourage the suckering. But in general, the plants I was showing tonight are prone. I'm encouraging that anyway. Like, I'm not trying to manage necessarily for with something like a spirea. Obviously, it just is the way it grows. I'm trying to manage for those multiple stems. So, Sally, is there a particular species you're worried about?
It seems like just recently I've been looking at native plants, and I want to say maybe the button bush, native shrubs, and it just seemed like every time I looked one up, it said suckering, and so that's kind of a vague answer, but that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I think that's a good. Basically, suckering is the sort of quality you're looking back for in a cutback shrub. So that's the ability to really vigorously come back from the roots. So with a button bush, you can actually train button bushes to be a small tree by removing the suckers and letting it grow. But it's just a different way of thinking about it. You won't get that long flowering, it can tend to be it's hard to maintain them that way, because in nature they tend to be a suckering shrub. That is, they tend to put up a lot of those vigorous sprouts from the roots all the time. So in my way of thinking, for a good cutback shrub, suckering is a good quality.
And can I just ask, because I think then when I read suckering, I think, oh, I'm just in a city lot, it's going to take over my whole garden. But you're saying what it really could mean, or may mean, is just many branches, many stems, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that it's going to be, what you would consider like a stoloniferous suckering shrub. That is, that it spreads and sends up new sprouts. Suckering can be coming from the main trunk, or it can be a spreading species. So it's a little bit of a vague term. So I think of, say, there's many plants that you think of becoming kind of like weedy, but like some of the wild roses, for example, will spread. They'll spread stoloniferously, so they have like shallow stems that spread just around the ground, and then they keep putting up new stems. And you cut those back, it will sprout up all over. But in the case of button bush, that's not the case. So you got to, I guess, do a little more research on the growth habit of the shrub too.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Another question from Judy is, if the frequently cut back shrubs need more fertilizing than those left alone longer, it seems like all the new growth would be more demanding.
That's a good question. I think if you're doing it every year and really trying to, it's just like herbaceous perennials. I think it's very similar, that you'll get a little better effect if you do some fertilizing. I tend not to do a lot of fertilizing with woody plants. Mainly what I do is use compost and compost-based mulches that are kind of a slow release type of thing. But if you are cutting back every year and you really want a big floral production, a little extra fertilizer can help. If you're doing it less than once a year, say in that 3 to 5 year range, then no, it's really going to have those reserves in the roots. Because you think about that, that root system is there to feed a much larger top, and if you take that top back, it's concentrating those reserves into a smaller area.
And then Brian Broderick suggested that for cutness, do half and half, leave some of the branches shorter to flower and cut the rest back so you can get the color.
That's one way to do it. I think with, say something like lilacs, people do that a lot, where they don't want to take them all out and lose flowering for a year or two. The danger is that partly it's an aesthetic thing. I think that it can look a little awkward to have the older stems and lots of these new stems coming up, but it's another way to do it, certainly.
And Julia Kerr has a one-word question, Laura Petalum. Not sure what she was asking.
If you can cut those back. Yeah, Laura Petalum, no, they're sort of like the they're related to witch hazels. I think, and they're evergreen, so they're generally, though, they respond really well to cutting back. And I would, understanding that if you cut those back during the dormant season, you're going to lose that flowering for the year. But you can cut Laura Petalums back on that kind of, 5 to 7 year. You can cut them back pretty hard on that 5 to 7 year rotation, and just know that you're going to lose flowering for that first spring.
And Marianne Wilburn has brought up a problem that is one for many of us, which is that we don't want the deer to browse. And so we try and keep some of the plants above deer browsing height. In her case, the Ilex verticillata. Does a hard prune at a 4-foot level achieve the same regenerative effect?
Yeah. With something like Ilex, it would. And that is an issue. I mean, a lot of times we have a lot of deer at the Morris Arboretum. So sometimes we have to, cage them in that early phase so they can get back up. But yeah, you can cut them back, because what you're doing there is really more like it's more like pollarding, where you get it up to a certain height and then you're cutting it back most of that new growth and letting it resprout again. And if you do that with the Ilex every 3-4 years, something like that, you can keep it in. And I never tried it with Ilex. It's an interesting idea. I think I might try that. That's a good one to experiment with.
And then Lynn Title asks about her 30-year-old fringe tree, which is a single trunk tree. And she's wondering if she whacks it back, will it rejuvenate from the roots, and how far should she cut it back?
Yeah, this is one of those cases where it's major surgery. As long as it's healthy, I think that's the thing. Like, you have to think about this idea of food reserves, and if the fringe tree is otherwise healthy, but it has just gotten so out of control that it's you could cut it back, just basically chainsaw it down to within 4 inches of the ground or so during the winter time, and it should put up the sprouts. Now, the caveat there is that should is more is less affirmative than will, but because you're relying on those adventitious buds to come out of the trunk. But that's another shrub that it's adapted to that idea of, you think about many shrubs like fringe tree, they grow under trees and things fall down on them, or fire comes through and they have to resprout. So as long as it's healthy, it should come back fine from that if you do it during the dormant season.
And then Judy wants to know if Weigella and Corylopsis are also good candidates.
Yeah, they're both good. You'll lose the flowering for a year, but they're fine to be able to handle that way.
And Melissa Mackey said that ice broke the top off a 30-year-old dwarf lace leaf Japanese maple, and there's only 2 foot of the trunk left, and is wondering if it's likely to sprout a stem.
That's going to be adventitious buds, and also it may be grafted too. So I think it's hard to know without seeing it. I think you have a decent chance that it's going to resprout, but just watch those. Watch anything that's coming out from ground level, because typically Japanese maples are grafted, and you don't want the understock coming up and taking over.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then Margot asked about a whole bank of Garden Club azaleas that she did not prune this past spring and is wondering if they should be pruned this winter and if they will still bloom if she does prune them this winter.
Azaleas they flower on the old woods, so you won't, if you prune them back in the wintertime, you won't get any flowers. What I would do would be in that case to wait till after they flower, and just the safest thing is to prune the new growth that comes up after flowering. Let it get up to the point where it's it's not all the way expanded. So say in late May, early June, and then take some of that back, take it down to maybe halfway, and you still will then have enough time for those to resprout and form flower buds the next year. I mean, you could certainly do a hard pruning on those, I think, but it's going to be several years before you will see flowers again.
Okay, and then the picture of the old tools, where was that taken?
That was Louise, if you're still on there, can you help me remember the name of the botanic out there in York, the new botanical garden in York? That's almost a public garden. Is she gone? So I'm blanking out of the name, but in
Milbourne?
Yeah, Milbourne, but it's in the York area of not York. Is it York? Yeah, but it's a private estate that's in the process of becoming a public garden.
Okay.
So it's a by appointment only, but soon their plan is to become a public garden.
Okay, and there are no more new questions in the chat. Lots of thank yous, and I'll forward that to you later. Does anybody have any questions they want to unmute and ask directly? Well, Bill, people are just putting lots of things into the chat, and this has been a really informative talk that has geared us all up to get out our pruners and not be scared to go after it. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. It's been, and I love all the questions, really great questions. As a speaker, it's always helpful to know that people have questions and they're interested, and sorry I couldn't see you in person, but hope to see you at the Arboretum sometime.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.